Okay, good morning. My name is Ryan Kelsey. As Frank said, I'm an Associate Director for Education and Research at CCNMTL. I want to welcome you to our first panel of the day, a partnership in educational innovation. As we begin, I want to pay special recognition to those of you in the audience who are longtime collaborators and friends of the center. I see a few of you here in the group. The reason I want to do that is our two panelists this morning are both long-standing collaborators with the center. In fact, they were two of the very first people to walk through our doors in Butler Library back in 1999 and 2000. And I was there, and I still haven't quite figured out why it is that we haven't freed ourselves from each other since then, but maybe we'll be able to clear that up a little bit today. But whether you're one of those longtime collaborators or you're brand new to us, I think you'll find this panel intriguing because I think it's going to demonstrate a new dimension to the center's project and service work, and that is course and degree program creation, which is not something that we've presented here in the past. Rather than the typical scenario where a faculty member approaches us with a course that has a particular need that we're going to address, in this case, at least in the case of our first panelist, he represented a group of faculty from several different departments who approached the center with a fairly straightforward idea. We want to change the core curriculum. We need your help. And in the second case, not to be outdone, we had the deans of an entire graduate school approach us and say, we have an idea. We'd like to create a new degree program using a pedagogical approach untested in our field and untried by our faculty. We need your help. So this panel is going to explore those two recent partnerships where the center tried to assist in the development of both the curricular and pedagogical approach, of course with technology as a key element in that process. So our panelists this morning are David Helfand, Professor and Chair of the Astronomy Department. He's going to discuss the creation of Frontiers of Science, which is a new required course for first-year undergraduates in Columbia College's core curriculum. Then we'll have David Klatell, Vice Dean and Professor of the Graduate School of Journalism. He will describe the process of creating a curriculum based on the case study method for their new master's program in journalism, including the first case jointly created by the Journalism School and CCNMTL entitled Building the Front Page of the Washington Post. And for those of you that might be concerned, no, you don't have to be David to have a long-standing relationship with our center, but it doesn't hurt. It keeps it simple for us. The format for this session is going to be as follows. Each panelist is going to speak for about 20 to 25 minutes. As time allows, we'll take questions in between their presentations, but primarily we'll do the Q&A at the end. We'll have some microphones roaming around, so if you have a question, if you would please wait for a microphone to get to you. That way everyone will be able to hear your question and we'll address it as best we can.
Well, as Ryan noted, I'm an astronomer, but I'm an astronomer that actually doesn't know which end of the telescope to look through. This is not wholly a consequence of technical incompetence, although there's a large dash of that in it as well, but it's a consequence of the fact that my graduate training and my subsequent 30 years of research has not been in looking at the universe through the incredibly narrow window of what we parochially call light. The temperature of the surface of the sun and the strength of gravity on the surface of the earth has combined with 400 million years of evolution to allow us to develop something we call our eyes, which we think are really important and which provide us an enormous amount of information about the world around us and, for an astronomer, about the sky above. But it turns out this is a really poor tool because it only samples a little less than an octave, a little less than a range of a factor of 2 in wavelengths of the factor of 50 octaves of radiation that the universe is sending us. We're 98% blind to what the universe is telling us if we use our eyes, or the biggest telescope we can use on Earth, which just focuses that same narrow single octave of light down so we can see it better with our eye or with some electronic camera. Now, since I've been working in this field for a very long time, I've given innumerable public talks, and of course now, as of this semester, 29 years worth of lectures to Columbia undergraduates. And one of the first things I have to do in any such talk or any such class is to get across this point, that we have an incredibly impoverished view of the universe because our eyes are such lousy receptors, they pick up only 2% of the radiation that is being sent to us. And for the first 20-some years of doing this, I always say, just imagine how bad that is. I mean, your ears at least can hear 10 octaves of the scale. And so if you listen to music, you hear 10 full octaves. Imagine if your ears were so lousy that they only picked out 1 octave, like that. And so I would give the analogy. Imagine you listening to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, and you could only hear a single octave at a time, you know, the 448 to the 888. What would it sound like? Well, shortly after Frank introduced me to Ryan, I told him this story, and he said, oh, well, we can probably do something about that. And this is what we did. We took the Ode to Joy. He found, within a couple of days, a clever graduate student in the electronic music school up in Prentice. We went over to the lab. We took our little CD of Beethoven's Ninth. We used the software. In an hour, we had produced this. We call it Helfand's Ninth Symphony. This is what you normally hear, from the piccolos to the basses, the entire 10 octaves. But now I'm going to put a filter on it electronically that gives you just 1 octave at a time. So all the music's still there, but I filtered it the same way your eye filters the light from space, from the 440A to the one above. Right now I'll take a different slice of the spectrum. So that's just the octave below that. You're hearing only a single octave at a time. And clearly, it doesn't sound very much like the Ode to Joy. You can recognize it, but listen to this. That's 6 octaves below what you normally could hear. And then, if we jump a few octaves above, all the same music, it's just filtered in this clever way. It sounds like a bunch of angry crickets, right? Not like a symphony orchestra. What you actually want to hear is this, where your ear hears the full 10 octaves at once. And so you can now see how hopelessly impoverished our view of the universe is if we only use our eye. Well, it took a few hours for that 20-year-old analogy to turn into something that everybody could use. I've used this in my class ever since. A few months after we made this, I gave a plenary talk at the American Physical Society, so this was, 1,000 physicists, PhD physicists. This got a standing ovation, and I must have had 400 requests to have this so they could use it in their class to get across this idea in such a dramatic way. And subsequently, I put it on my website, and I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of people have now heard this creation that just came about from a casual conversation of someone technically incompetent with someone technically competent, mainly Ryan. As a consequence of that, I mean, finding competence in Columbia University is a very rare thing, we decided that maybe we'd try to exploit this for other bigger ideas. In 1982, as a matter of fact, which is a general measure of how long it takes things to get done here, I chaired a committee called Science in a Liberal Curriculum, which was to address the question, which I thought was rather a nagging one, that we had a core curriculum in Columbia College, every student taking the same course, reading the same book the same week, which covered history and philosophy, literature, art, and music, and, with that range of subjects, claimed to prepare intelligent citizens for life in a modern world. Well, it seemed to me something was missing there. Also, this curriculum, of course, is supposed to be the great ideas of Western civilization, and I was frequently want to point out that the only unique great idea of Western civilization, in that every culture has a literature and a music and an art, was Western science. That the core curriculum of Columbia College really had a fundamental lack in that it did not include science as part of the heart of the general education that we offer. Well, so this committee in 1982 recommended that we do something about that, and 22 years later, we actually managed to succeed. That's probably because in 1982 there wasn't any Center for New Media Teaching and Learning, and being technically incompetent, it wasn't conceivable how one would do this. In fact, there are no other universities in the country that we know of, with the exception of St. John's, where science is taught together with a group in the core of knowledge that everyone is supposed to know. Now, at St. John's, they do this in a way we didn't think we could implement here. They learn Greek so they can read the original mathematics. They learn Latin so they can read Newton's Principia. And we didn't think that was probably a good approach to science in the modern world. We wanted to do something that was a little more modern. And so we came up with this idea, over 20 years or so, of a course called Frontiers of Science, which would be required of all first-year students at Columbia to expose them to science at the same time they would be exposed to Plato and Homer and art and music of the West. Now, there's a major challenge in this enterprise because we are dealing if we're teaching all Columbia undergraduates at once, first-year students, with literally, last year at least, the National Intel Science Competition winner and people who can't do arithmetic. Now, putting them in the same classroom, the same lecture, the same seminars, giving them the same reading materials is clearly a challenge. Furthermore, providing a class for 550 students at once and organizing that is also considerably a challenge. And so the center was an obvious place to turn to start developing some of these ideas. The first thing you might want to say, if you're going to teach a general science course, what are you going to use as a textbook? Well, we had two ideas for that. One is we didn't want to teach an overview of 19th century chemistry and 17th century physics, which is the way one normally starts science in college, frankly, because it's boring. And so what we wanted to do is, rather than that, go to the forefronts of science, go to the places where we don't yet know all the answers, and teach students about what the exciting research areas were today. Furthermore, we wanted them to come away with some basic quantitative reasoning skills, some scientific habits of mind, as we call them, that they can apply not only to this course, but also to decisions they have to make throughout their lives. And so the first thing we did was to create a book called Scientific Habits of Mind, that would serve as sort of an underlaying of the course with all of the technical tools students would need while we were telling them about all the exciting science. I mean, if we gave them lectures on statistics, they'd all go to sleep, but it's essential to understand statistics if one is going to critically evaluate scientific papers of the kind that we give them. And so this book, rather than being on paper, is of course on the web. Ryan used something they developed earlier for art history, I guess it was, wasn't it? To develop this book online. Now, how do we use this to address this wide gap in the previous preparation of our students? We created two kinds of links. One kind of link is the link. That comes when an equation appears. Well, for most people, that equation wouldn't be too scary, but for some of our undergraduates, believe it or not, it is. So, at the end of the equation, there's a And when there's a you can go over here and go back just about as far as 8th grade, I guess, in mathematics, and get a full and thorough review of canceling units, of scientific notation, of how to range numbers in an equation. Now, many of our students, that's pretty straightforward. They know how to do that already. They're reading this book, but they come across a statement like, the eye can no longer see. The width of 1/4 of a strand of hair is too small for you to see. What is it that sets the practical limit of vision for the human mind? So that's an interesting question. And so you type the Y link because you want to know more. Why is this the limit? Your vision is limited by two numbers, which at first seem completely unrelated: the temperature of the surface of the sun and the strength of gravity on the surface of the earth. And we go on to a deep story, which includes, among other things, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony as recorded by me. Okay? And so, you see, we can go back, we can go drill into much deeper and richer material for the students who is interested, and yet we have the tutorials readily available in the context of the text for the students who are not. We have chapters on a number of things: graphical representation of data, why in that table of numbers was completely opaque, but this graph led to a major discovery. So we have lots of graphics in here about how to graph things and different kinds of illustrations, teaching them, for example, that images are in fact actually graphs because they're all digital now, and how these are constructed, and they learn a lot about that. We also do probability, we do statistics. We have a book, and this book is, among other things, free to the students because it's all online, it's all self-contained, it's heavily linked, and the students have access to this both with tutorials they need if they're weak and for enriched material if they're not. Now, managing this course in general is rather a daunting task, and so we go to the CourseWorks site. Now, I'm going to use last semester's as an example. What do we provide on the site for our students? So you see we have 540 students registered for this course. Right away on the introductory page, we of course provide the link to the book so they can go directly to Scientific Habits of Mind. But we provide a lot else for the students as well. This course works in that 11 o'clock on Monday morning, all 540 students show up in Miller Theater for a highly polished, we hope, a lecture by one of the senior faculty on one of the 4 subjects that we'll be covering during each semester. In the fall, for example, we covered the discovery of planets around other stars, how functional MRI imaging helps one understand the way the brain connects to human behavior. rapid global climate change, the paleoclimatological record and the potential future for climate change on Earth, and the biodiversity crisis of Earth. Those are the sort of contemporary subjects we're covering. The students come into this lecture, and they can come into the lecture with the PowerPoint slides laid out before them because we provide in 3 different formats the slides for them in advance. And so they can take the lectures, they can take the slides, print them in a friendly format of 8 slides per page, and bring them to lecture to write notes on. The first question was, how many planets are there in this picture? The surprising answer is a very large number. At the end of the lecture, 10 to the 16th is the number. So the students have the lectures available to them for each of the classes before the class begins so they can have the slides and take notes on them. They found that very convenient. We discovered this by actually weren't giving the lecture notes to the students, but we were printing them out for ourselves to take notes on, because one of the aspects of this course is that, of course, I have to teach neuroscience and climate change and biodiversity as well as my field of astrophysics, and everybody else does too. So this is quite an experience for the faculty as well. In addition, everything else for the class is also done online. So, for example, we have a large number of class files. Each week, there's a class file corresponding to the subject and lecture. So, for example, the second astronomy seminar unit here has several required readings, which are instantly downloadable. Some of them are readings from Scientific American or American Scientist. Some of them are readings from Nature or Science, the real papers themselves, which we annotate with little sticky notes. Some of them are articles from the popular press, which we then sometimes compare to the original article published in a journal to see how the press is done. So the class files provide all of the reading material for the class, all of the assignments for the class, of which there's one due every week, and as a consequence, the entire class is totally free to the students. Now let me go back and show you. So the lecture has this one set of 540 students in the course, but each course, the second meeting each week is in a 20-student seminar, consistent with the core curriculum notion that teaching with faculty in small classes is the way to go. And so, in my seminar, I have information directly about the way I evaluate students and things like that. But we also, importantly, have a discussion board. And the discussion board, which I must confess I was skeptical of, turned out to be extremely valuable, because what I'll do is each week I'll post some discussion question, and then the students, by 8 a.m. of the day of the seminar, have to respond. And so, number one, I can see what they understand and what they don't. Number two, we get some pretty vigorous debates going, because some of these discussion questions are controversial, like, should we join the Kyoto Protocol because greenhouse gases are going to destroy the climate of Earth? And the students get to argue back and forth and state their positions and come to class much better prepared to have a rigorous discussion. So every week there's a discussion like that. Now, it's not just for the students that this is valuable and totally free, it's also for the faculty. Any of you who has in the past taught with a large number of other faculty in a single course, not something we do very often, sort of interestingly here, but in this case we're talking about 10 or 12 senior faculty and 11 postdoctoral fellow lecturers. And so what we do is have a separate website inside the CourseWorks system for developing the course. And this course develops in real time every week because, in fact, science develops in real time. The lectures from last year have to be updated for this year. The problems that we set for the students, the discussion questions, the readings, all get updated. And so what we do is we have a set of class files that are accessible to all of the faculty and include, for example, the answers to the questions we set for the students. Since they're outside of our field, we don't always know them, so that's really helpful. But more important, we have this discussion board, which allows us to discuss anything from just general aspects of the course, grading policies, seminar ideas, other resources that people come across. An article in the Science Times this week referred to last week's lecture. Isn't that cool? Give it out to your students. To, under each seminar, what exactly was the weekly individual assignment, who assigned what, how it worked for them, how the discussion question worked for them, and then last but not least, developing the final exam. So here we go. The final exam questions were coordinated by one of our lecturers. He said, you know, send me your final exam questions. The construction of this exam is a non-trivial undertaking each semester. And right here we have each person submitting interesting ideas for questions for the final exam, which we can then stitch together largely online and get together and minimize the number of meetings we have. In summary, I think it's fair to say that this course is a significant new contribution to Columbia's general education. It offers its students. It's the first example we know of a true general education course required of everyone. And we have hopes to export this rather significantly. My co-director Darcy Kelly here and I were on Science Friday on NPR a couple of weeks ago and got literally hundreds of requests for some of these materials from high school teachers, community college teachers, professors, students, random people from around the country who happen to hear us on this show. I'm sure this would be valuable for many people. But what I want to conclude by saying is that without the, well, support's the wrong word, support and active collaboration and contribution of ideas, it's very unlikely that we would have managed to produce a product like this for our students. There's a final aspect of doing some experiment like this, and we have actually a 5-year experiment underway to see if this course actually is valuable, and that's evaluation. And evaluation is something which, well, university faculty want to do, right? They assign little grades. At Columbia, they're all A's, so it doesn't really matter very much, to students at the end of the semester. They rarely evaluate whether what they're doing is effective. They rarely evaluate whether the curriculum they're offering and the style in which they're offering it actually has an impact on the student's ability to reason and their basic knowledge base. And so evaluation is something else which the Center for New Media Teaching and Learning has a lot of expertise in. And Matt Ryan, maybe you want to say a couple words about what we're doing to evaluate this enterprise.
Sure. Obviously, it's a big challenge to evaluate a course with over 500 students distributed over 28 sections, I think, of seminar. Alina's nodding her head, so I think I got that right. So what we've done, at least to start off with, is besides being heavily involved in the weekly faculty meetings and evaluating the postings that are here week to week and consolidating them for subsequent years, we also developed online surveys for students to fill out at the end of the term. And again, we use CourseWorks to do that. Probably the most interesting, or maybe it's puzzling, finding from the first year of doing the survey was that students rated the lectures and the seminars higher than they rated the course overall. Say, what else is there? To just say a little more about that, they held the lectures in pretty high regard. They held their seminar leaders in even higher regard. So we decided to address that by making the course in the second year even more seminar-centric, if you will, or more seminar-focused. So some of the changes that we implemented based on the survey were to have basically all the communication, all the assignments for the course come from the seminar leader, so that from the student's point of view, that 20-person group and that leader is really the person that they go to as their instructor for this course, and that's the real focus of their attention. The other thing we did to address the large lecture, which is unique at Columbia, there's not another course that has this number of students all together all at once, was to break the lecture up with some question and answer during the lecture, even with that large size group, and also to require students at the end of the lecture to submit a question to their seminar leader on their way out the door. That's a nice way of linking what's going on in the lecture to the seminar, because each seminar leader has a stack of questions about that lecture in which to guide their session that they're going to hold later that week. We saw, at least this last fall, a great increase in attendance and engagement by adding that this fall, and I think we'll, again, we're still waiting for some fall evaluation results from this year to come in, but I'm confident that we're going to see even more improvement as we continue to do this. And again, this is an ongoing process. As David said, it's a 5-year project to bring this to the standard that the core curriculum has. Did I leave anything out, David?
No, I just want to say another thing about the lecture questions. I don't remember if that was your idea, but it was a brilliant idea. To have the student jot down a question the lecture stimulated. The other great virtue of this is that after the lecture each Monday, we have a staff meeting to discuss what we're going to do in seminar that week. And you see all the faculty frantically reading through their lecture questions because they're not going to know the answers to some of them, and they want to ask the lecturer while they're there. In any event, to conclude, I just say that it really is inconceivable to me, having had this idea in 1982, seeing it take 20 years to come into fruition. It just wouldn't have happened without the Center for New Media Teaching and Learning and their active collaboration in this process. And so I would encourage any of you that has even an idea this big or as small as slicing up Beethoven's Ninth to contact this organization, because I think they've made an enormous difference in the ability of faculty at this university to deliver truly unique educational experiences and content for our students.
Frank mentioned that I was one of the early walk-in collaborators with CCNMTL. I think I was could be more properly described as one of the early nudges. My starting point is, I think, very, very different. I'm going to tell you a little bit about our school, because it's an utterly different universe than no pun intended, than the one that in which David works. And our starting point in being interested in CCNMTL cooperation and collaboration with us was actually much more heavily on the teaching side than on the student learning side. Not to say it's one or the other, but our school is it's one-year program. We have several different one-year programs now, but they're pretty intensive and short. Our entire enrollment is less than half of the number of students that are in this one course, in the Frontiers of Science course. Our faculty are almost universally drawn from the profession. So it skews their approach to teaching in several important ways. One, 90% have never taught before, anywhere. They may have guest lectured, but as those of you who are in the classroom on a regular basis know, guest lecturing is like being an uncle. You know, as soon as the baby cries, you say, oh, I'm out of here. And because of the high level of experience and professional attainment we insist upon before hiring anybody, it is the second or sometimes their third career. So they enter the school. The average age of our hires is remarkably high. It's not uncommon for us to have assistant professors in their late 50s because they just arrived on the campus when they were 54 or 55 years old. We had a recent tenure case of someone who was 63. So at the same age, other units of the university may be attempting to incentivize retirement. We've got new teachers without a tradition in pedagogy, and frankly, to make it more challenging, they come from a business that is journalism, which is a very kind of top-down organization where there's believed to be, the urban myth is there's a right answer and a wrong answer to things, and where everyone is trained in a certain mode of decision-making or expecting someone above them in the chain of command to make the decisions for them. And it's a very difficult transition for them into the classroom. And to say, you know, we want you to empower your students to think. We want you to challenge them with a range of ideas, but I almost have to beat it out of them that your role is not primarily to be the holder of all the answers. That an appropriate course is not, you know, I get up in front of a class and I throw out question after question after question, and then I provoke them into giving the wrong answers and sort of say, ha, here are the right answers. And out they come. You know, it's a very discouraging experience for students. And I must say, for faculty, after a couple of years, it's boring. So my starting point was, how can we change the dynamic of teaching to make it less a linear process and less this sort of didactic delivery of truths from on high? And so we've tried various other approaches, some with more or less success, and CCNMTL has partnered with us on them. Our big new approach is, as Frank mentioned, the case study method, which has really never been tried in any journalism school. in a formal sense. One of the other great flaws of journalism education, and perhaps education in other professional schools which don't have a strong tradition of case study method a la the law school, or in some cases the business school, is teaching by anecdote. And many faculty members regard that as case study. They say, well, I told them all about the time, I told them all about 9/11 and what we were doing in the newsroom that day, and when I realized what had happened, and what I did next, and who did I call, and the phones didn't work, and the printers couldn't get there from Brooklyn, and we didn't have enough pulp and paper for the extra edition, and the trucks couldn't travel around even if we had to deliver the paper. So what the heck do you do at a newspaper when you can't put out the newspaper? But that's teaching by anecdote, however fascinating it might be. And we're attempting, under the leadership of Nick Lemon, and with absolutely invaluable help from a young lady sitting right here, Rebecca Reich. Stand up so they get to see you. She's actually the person we've hired to help us develop these cases in a very formal way, which means, first and foremost, go out and do your research, report on it. We've spent lots of time, she has particularly, visiting the people involved in the cases, visiting their workplaces, observing, taking notes, taking video. Ryan and a crew went with her to the Washington Post to begin work on this very first project. This is also quite different than David's project in that it's very much in the beta stage. It has not been used in a classroom. You're looking at the component parts assembled in a certain way that we think will work, and it has had one tryout. I was selected.
Lucky.
To do a short version of this with our participating students in front of last spring's alumni reunion. It was quite an interesting little adventure. But this is all still a work in progress, and we hope to develop a curriculum of case studies using these kind of teaching and learning tools to enhance, and as I say, the teaching as much as the learning. I think we can't do one without the other. So let me ask you, just before we go this, how many of you read the Washington, or have read the Washington Post, or lived or live in the Washington area? Okay, so here's a quick quiz. You're not allowed to answer. Here's a quick quiz. Is the Washington Post a national or a regional newspaper? How many think it's a national paper? Okay. And of those of you who believe it's a regional paper, how many of you have lived or had some kind of family connection to the Washington, Virginia, Maryland area? Okay. Well, our first presumption, and the presumption of most New Yorkers, in fact, most people outside of Washington, is it's a national paper. It, after all, covers the government of the United States, and that's what we know it for. And the first thing we learned when we went down to begin interviewing everyone from literally the top editor of the paper down to subsection assistant sports editor and various other folks, they insisted without exception, we are a local and regional paper. The New York Times is a national paper. Len Downey said to me, not the Post, we're a local paper. Don Graham, the former publisher, and his family controls the paper, regional paper. We serve a local audience. It just so happens that the major business in our local town is the government of the United States. But, in theory, if it had been IBM, we'd be all over IBM. So we're in a different business than the New York Times, which was in itself a starting point for all of us to ask questions about, okay, if that's their presumption, how does the paper reflect what they see as their mission? The other thing that you just need to know quickly is that you see on the upper left the mission of the front page, and And it's a bit of a misnomer because there are, of course, multiple front pages in any newspaper. That is, the section pages. And we know for a fact, I won't do a poll, that people read papers in very idiosyncratic ways. Everybody turns to whatever their favorite section is and reads it first, puts the rest to the side, and then gets to it later. So the front page of your section, by interest, is really important. And then, of course, the Post has regionalized editions. They have editions in Virginia, in the wealthy Virginia suburbs, and then a little bit further out, a metro edition for the District of Columbia itself, which is different in a very significant ways, not only because the demographics of their readership are very different in the district than they are in Virginia or Maryland. Here's the metro section. But also we discovered the way people buy the paper is very different. In the suburbs, people get a subscription. It comes to their doorstep. The city, people buy it from newsstands. And again, we could just test this on Broadway. It's easiest to understand in the magazine business. You walk by a newsstand, you see a stack of whatever your magazine is, and that cover is what's supposed to sell the magazine. The decision to pick it up and buy it is based on that cover and the photography and the layout and the design. So for a large part of their readership, the decision about what goes on the front page is not just an editorial decision, but a crucial commercial decision. Will you buy that paper? And you'll see as we go through this example some interesting confluence and, in a couple of cases, collisions of those two things. So we've tried to replicate a day at the Washington Post. So it begins something like this. First thing in the morning at about 7 o'clock, the senior editors arrive. They get a briefing from something called the 24-hour news desk, which is what it sounds to be. These are the people that work all night gathering information. And they kind of brief the editors and say, well, this happened overnight, or these are the most interesting things we think will happen today. So the editors can start to think how they assign reporters. And of course, intrinsically tied to that decision is what's going to go on the front, because we're going to assign our better reporters to the things that we believe have a higher priority, the things we believe that by late tonight or 24 hours from now, when this paper we're designing now is being read, will hold people's interest and remain the most important thing. They will then pass that down to their section editors. You see national, foreign, metro, financial, and if we scroll down, there's sports and all. There they are. And in each section, those editors, the middle management layer, will go through the same exercise with their staff of writers, reporters, and editors and say, okay, I would like you to do this and you to do that, and also tell me what you're working on. What can you volunteer to the paper? Oddly enough, at the Washington Post, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, they ring a bell, just like we did here this morning, to call the editors back together into the conference room for an update on how is everything panned out from what we thought would happen in the course of the day. And they get this series of reports. We're doing well on this story, this other one is dead in the water, or we're going to have to hold it for another day, it's not going to be ready, or the person we thought was going to be the key source isn't available, or in one lovely case we stumbled on about the cherry trees in Washington, which is a big deal in Washington and in the newspaper. A wonderful, it turned out to be an obituary profile about the lady that, there's some famous weatherman in Washington who, as part of his job, goes on the air and predicts the exact day of peak beauty for the blossoms, so all the tourists and everybody at the front page every year. And people take this seriously. It's more serious than Groundhog Day, and that's about as serious as it gets. And they stumbled on the story that actually he didn't make that prediction at all. There was some nice little old lady in an obscure bureaucracy in the horticultural department, something like that. And he would just call her up and say, yeah, Mrs. Smith, what do you think? And she'd give him the information, and nobody had ever heard of her, and she had died. And in her obituary, so first of all, he was bereft of this crucial information, as were the people of the district. But it turned out her story was a much more interesting one than his. And they stumbled on this, so it threw everything into a tizzy. So anyway, that's generally how they do it. So we're going to now fast forward to 3 o'clock in the afternoon when they develop something called the budget. The budget is sort of the top-ranking stories that come up from each section. And at this 3 o'clock meeting, the editors now come back and try and convince, the section editors try and convince the bosses, this is what I think, what our people think should go on the front. And of course, it's a competition among sections because people's careers rise and fall to some extent on this. So let's see what some of our options are for front page. The National Desk brings forward, well, Hamid Karzai, the Afghan president, was in Washington, and they have photos of him with various American leaders, with the President of the United States, that's Bush and Karzai walking into the White House. So it's not only a big international story in a time of war, but it has photo support. And in Washington, pictures of the President, whomever here, perhaps she may be, are an automatic seller. This is a big deal. So this was one that got a lot of push. So every time we get to a point in the discussion in this meeting, and the student wants to know, okay, who are the people that are making the decision? What's their background? How much do they know about the particular kind of story that's under review? And so here's a short bio of Len Downey, who runs the meeting, at least 3 of the 5 weekdays every week. And we have similar profiles of lots of other senior editors. And so here's the Karzai-Bush story, which most people are going to think is pretty important. Here's the top story coming up from Metro. It's an important school story. School stories, as any parent in the room can tell you, are important because they affect everybody's kids, they affect your taxes, they hold communities together or break them apart. So almost anything about schools. And this was a very hot story about how lousy the school system is in the district, and there was a funding issue in one of the big Maryland suburbs, and it had been going on for a while, and people are angry, and you can see the quote at the end, you know, somebody saying, and the second thing is like, you know, God, it's 60 to 70,000 kids who have essentially been leaderless for a year or so. This is a hot button issue in New York or Washington or Seattle or any place else. So they really wanted to run with this. One of the downsides of this story, at least from a decision-making question, was there were evening events around it. That is, angry public meetings with the school board, and there was going to be one. So not quite sure what was going to... This hadn't played out yet. This story was still very much in action. The sports offered a very interesting set of decisions because... show them the pictures, Ryan. This is the National Basketball Association finals from last year, which involved the Detroit Pistons and the Los Angeles, a well-deserved thrashing of the heinous Los Angeles Lakers, he said non-judgmentally. Now here was the question that kept resonating through the paper. Why would this go on the front page? An awful lot of people don't care about professional basketball, and from a local perspective, this is no Washington team or even a Baltimore team is involved. This is Detroit and Los Angeles. It's in another time zone. It's, you know. So when we went and asked, Rebecca and I and some students went to meet with the assistant sports editor, a fellow named Vita. We said, what's the deal? Why would this get pushed so hard? He said, well, we had graphics, we had art, and secondly, there's a sub-story that only locals would know, that is a lot of the best players on the Detroit Pistons who are winning this championship formerly played for the Washington team and were traded away. So this was regarded as a gigantic faux pas by the local management, and that gave it a local angle, they thought, even though the teams themselves were not. So it had art, it had a local angle, and you know, this is action photography. If you click on those couple, I mean, this is good stuff. And unlike many of the typical stories they get of, well, Bush walking Karzai into the White House, which is a standard trope in Washington. You could just take out Karzai and put in Karl Rove. These pictures can be cropped many different ways. They can be shaped. They can be, you know, you can do a lot with this stuff. Okay, so there were some others, but these were the major contenders for the front. And what Ryan and his crew were able to do for us was to build this matrix of a front page of the Washington Post. Now, we debated whether to have a blank page and say to the students, you'll see down the left-hand side, these are actual layouts. We won't show them to you quite yet, that the students made. We gave them these decision points, the real ones. We gave them the real materials that were being considered for the front page, and we said, you design the front page, and explain to us why. There was a hostage story, which, by the way, had the advantage, I'm sorry to say it that way, I'm speaking like a journalist, it was more trenchant because a small child was involved in the hostage taking, and there was, again, a photograph of that. So, you know, children in danger being rescued by, that's also a sort of a can't-miss story. There's the shot that went with it. And we said to them, all right, here we'll lay out a sort of matrix for front page, but you have all these choices as to what you put where, what goes above the fold. Remember, that's the front of what's above the fold is what you see on a stack of papers. That's the selling part of the paper. And let us, you know, we'll design your own and we'll talk about it. So let's put up a couple of the student works. Here, of course, we don't fill in the full text of all the articles because you wouldn't be able to read it, and as long as we know what story they chose. So this student, Kimberly, chose to put the basketball story on top, and you can see the very small space she gave to the presidents of the United States and Afghanistan in the left as compared to an out-of-town basketball game. And then there's hostage, and then there's a story out of the Mideast. And there was wildfire. There were western wildfires in the United States, New Mexico, Arizona. They had wildfires, and they had a kind of a policy story about, you know, had the United States now skimped on firefighting resources, and why was so much of the public's land burning, and what we're going to do about it. Not a local story, more of a sort of a wonky story, but she put that down there. So that's her layout. Here is Omar's layout, and the president and Karzai replaced the basketball game, although the basketball game is still on page 1. But notice some other stuff has disappeared entirely, and if you look carefully at the space that's given, the amount of room that's given to these various things, they change quite a lot. You just run through them. This student chose a very highly graphical front page without, you know, with proportionally less text. So that's a question we had to ask. Here's Ralph Nader, by bless his heart. He made the front page. The debate about this story was they had done several Nader stories in the recent weeks. We had given them a look at the front pages of the Washington Post from the preceding days. The real day we used was June 16. And of course, this had just preceded it. Reagan died, and basically for a week, that ran as the front of the page, right? Because the funeral was, one of the funerals was in Washington, and, you know, as a consequence, they had all this pent-up work they had done that couldn't get into the paper or couldn't get onto the front page. And they were holding all these stories, the wildfire story. And the question about Nader was, Nader had been on the front page a couple of times in recent months. The issue was, had he been the spoil sport who ruined Al Gore's chances to get elected? And they were saying, have we done enough Nader? Is there another justification for putting Nader on the front page yet again? Well, so one of 6 students said, yes, let's get Nader on that front page again. Okay, so this gives you a pretty good look at the tool. And the last thing I want to say before taking whatever questions you might have is going through this exercise really changed my own view about, as I say, the sort of teacher-centric classroom. And we are now trying, and so far at least, meeting really enthusiastic responses from the Graduate School of Journalism faculty to try this method of teaching. This won't be our default method, it won't be the only method, but sort of getting the teacher to back out a little bit and say, let's do some collaborative thinking and you come up with some of the answers and I'll guide you through the processes rather than let me tell you the answers, has been a real revelation for me as a teacher, and we hope it will spread to the rest of the faculty. Rebecca is now working on the 3rd in a series of what we hope will be 6 or 7 case studies, and we're pleased enough with the way that this worked, and absolutely pleased with our collaboration with CCNMTL, that we're actively trying to raise a lot of money to create a case study center inside the journalism school, so that we have writers, reporters, case developers, our own people who can work more collaboratively on the technical side with CCNMTL, so that we will be publishers of these. And again, as David's mentioned, we think that there's a market for this outside of Columbia, because in our field at least, most people tend to look to us as the leading school, and nobody else has ever tried formal case study at all, much less case study in this kind of enriched environment and this participatory environment. So that's what we're up to. Thank you very much. Happy to take questions.